Welcome to the Sunday morning at the Marxist Library, which is a project of the Institute for the Critical Study of Society. My name is Richard Fallenbaum, and I will be the moderator today. A recording of this session will be loaded on YouTube in a couple of days. At ICSS, we're committed to applying the insights of Karl Marx to the struggles against exploitation, oppression, and war. To turn Marx's 11th Secret on Feuerbach on its head, in order to successfully change the world, it is necessary first to understand it. Marilyn Langlois is a member of the ICSS community who organized this session. We are very grateful for her initiative, and I want to just say I hope other members of the community will follow her example. We want input from everybody. She will introduce our speaker and turn it over to him. And after he speaks, we'll have some announcements and then a question and answer and discussion session. So go ahead, Marilyn.
Thank you, Richard. Matthew Ehret was first brought to my attention about 3 years ago by Vanessa Beeley, that intrepid independent journalist in Damascus to whom we owe so much for her incisive reporting. So thank you, Vanessa. Matthew is a true phenom. He draws on his expansive knowledge about both global current events and history going back to ancient times in the areas of geopolitics, economics, literature, arts and culture, science, philosophy, and more, to challenge and enlighten us on our way of looking at the world.
Marilyn, you're
muted.
You're on mute.
Oh, yeah. You haven't heard me. You haven't heard anything I've said, right?
We heard some of it.
No,
sorry, that's my fault. So go ahead.
How did I
thought
get
muting somebody else, and you slipped in there.
Okay, so I want to start with, and even if it's a repetition, it's worth repeating. Matthew Ehret is a true phenom. He draws on his expansive knowledge about both global and current events and history going back to ancient times in the areas of geopolitics, economics, literature, arts and culture, science, philosophy, and more to challenge and enlighten our way of looking at the world. And you can read more about him in the bio on the announcement for today's event, including mention of his 4-part book, The Clash of the Two Americas, with refreshing insights about certain often forgotten aspects of U.S. history that are worth resurrecting in today's dismal times. And you can also follow him on Substack and several other outlets. I thought that you all at ICSS would be interested in hearing from him in the interest of cross-fertilization. While Matt is not a Marxist, he is decidedly anti-imperialist and pro-peaceful resolution of conflicts and finding win-win solutions. He rejects the rabid Russophobia and Sinophobia being peddled brazenly and dangerously throughout the West and welcomes the current shift away from the fascism of the Anglo-American Empire towards a more multipolar world that benefits all of humanity. Now, if ICSS member Bonnie Weiss watches this, she, of course, is our resident expert on Paul Robeson. She'll be glad to know that Matthew is a huge fan of Robeson and has written several pieces about him. Matthew has also referred to Grover Furr in several of his public interviews, which I think you'll appreciate, since Professor Furr is typically gaslit and ignored, both mainstream and alternative media, but is a regular presenter here at ICSS. Many of us have gotten to know him personally. I'm hoping to see a conversation between Matthew Ehret and Grover Furr published at some point soon. And just one last thing I'll mention, I think there's some noise. Are people?
Yeah.
I got it. I put it on mute.
Okay. One last thing I'll mention is that I'm putting links in the chat for 2 recent articles Matthew posted on Substack, which I highly recommend to you. One was actually written 2 years ago on May 8th and reposted this year, titled "For Victory Day, It's Time to Think About Finally Winning World War II." Not to detract at all from the momentous defeat of Hitler's army and the Third Reich, accomplished mostly by the Soviet Union, of course, but reminding us how the hegemonic financial networks outside Germany that underwrote fascism back then are still with us today, wreaking havoc in many arenas. And another one, very revealing, entitled "The Tiananmen Square Hoax: Massacre or Failed Color Revolution," that came out just last week on the anniversary of that misunderstood day. And speaking of hoaxes, Matthew is now going to talk to us about the Gouzenko hoax that started the Cold War. Matthew, take it away.
Okay, Matthew, before you start, give me a moment to mute everybody and then you unmute yourself. Is that okay?
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm going to mute everybody here. Mute, unmute themselves. Look meeting. I'm doing this for the first time, muting and
I
muting.
actually, Raj, I went through I took the liberty because I have co-hosting powers to just
Yeah,
mute
yeah,
a ton
you
of
can do
people
it.
while
If you
you're
really-
so
Great.
I think most people are already by default mute now.
Okay.
However, that being said, anything that I should say, if I say something that if anybody wishes to interject with a question or something, even though we will do the Q&A at the end, feel free to take yourself off mute if it's something really pressing or important to jump into. Otherwise, there's going to be a really good flowing Q&A, I'm sure, that'll naturally evolve. So thank you, everyone, for putting this on and doing this, this type of educational process in a time of an intellectual dark age like we're living in is so valuable. It's better than gold and really, really important if we're going to be able to really recognize the historical dynamics at play and put ourselves into a situation where we can navigate through the minefield that could easily unleash a chain reaction set of decisions resulting in potentially a thermonuclear war, as I think everybody here thinks about quite a bit. Marilyn, thank you for those very generous remarks. I'll try to live up to that very high bar you set. And those articles are, well, one's an article, one's a presentation on Tiananmen Square. As a color revolution, I hope people find those edifying as well. The remarks that I'm going to be giving today will be drawing from some of the chapters from my recently published Clash of the Two Americas, Volume 2 and Volume 3. Volume 3 is the birth of Eurasian Manifest Destiny, with a picture of the Belt and Road Initiative and Ben Franklin kind of smirking at the audience. There's an irony in that, but it's something which is lost to, I think, most of the technocratic class currently sitting on top of this NATO Five Eyes monstrosity that are really not in any way familiar with the real dynamics shaping our collective history. So I'm going to go through a few slides, maybe a video or two featuring some music by Paul Robeson, and we'll get at the Gouzenko hoax one way or another. So here, let me first just showcase a little slideshow I put together last minute. So as we chose to call this thing the ideology of the Cold War, origin and evolution, I'm going to go through some context before we get at this Gouzenko hoax. I'm sure most people have an idea of what that is. For those who don't, just wait. There will be payoff here. We are obviously living in history. It's an important thing that people often, I think, mistake about what is this study of history. What is it supposed to be about? I think one of the reasons why it makes a lot of young people bored in school is because it's treated falsely as trivia about the past, that you're supposed to memorize with events and dates that you're supposed to get on place onto a test as far as answers to get grades to be rewarded. But there's no real passion. There's no sense of the living history itself. Because I think when looked at from the standpoint of the way I'm trying to look at it, that is, I think, more useful, is we see that history is actually futures that either manifested into existence, into reality, or failed to. But there's different competing ideas of what the future was supposed to be that various groups at different times organized to make happen, aka conspire, for good or for bad. And those ideas of the future either came closer to happening, or or just were sabotaged by virtue of some assassinations, some artificial manipulation. And it helps to recognize the existence of a financier oligarchy. That's another thing that I think is that destroys people's ability to appreciate what the human experience is we're taught to treat history devoid of any recognition of the actual existence of a continuous financier oligarchy, which has a certain modus operandi about it, transmitting its existence and manipulating human affairs for a very long time. Let's just say it that way. But when you do that, when you do reevaluate a lot of the things we took for granted in terms of the causes of assassinations, the causes of various wars, the causes of various peace processes, with the existence of an oligarchy in mind, things start snapping into making a lot more sense. The murder of JFK, how that's tied to the murder of Lincoln, how that's tied to things like 9/11, all of a sudden there's a continuous function, even though the particular individuals who participated in those various things are separated by large spaces of time. There's still a continuous function. And to the point that this is one thing that shook me up a long time ago, is that in looking more critically at the history of Canada, I was surprised to discover that the lone gunman story of Wilkes Booth killing Lincoln, the way it was popularly conveyed in mainstream history books, is full of holes. There's a much bigger picture. And the fact that something like that took place, 150 years ago, is still so controversial that lies have to be maintained about it, means that there's something going on in my world today that I have to think much more critically about. And that touches on what Marilyn was also mentioning about the fact that a lot of the very same financier networks that made Hitler possible, that made Mussolini possible, and the rise of fascism and eugenics as a pseudoscience that was being taught in McGill and Harvard and Yale and Oxford, and that was a real, like, Rockefeller-backed statistical science of breeding out the unfit in the human gene pool. That was a thing that was really big, and that was sort of the governing religion of the upper echelons of the Nazis. But that's ignored, and when you realize that there were these financier oligarchs behind the growth of fascism in the city of London, in Wall Street, all of a sudden it makes more sense why there was an assassination attempt against Franklin Roosevelt and a coup d'etat attempt with Smedley Butler in 1934, that Smedley Butler, the general, blew the whistle on. The very fact that many of these same Nazis were never punished after World War II, but rather were given new assignments under Allen Dulles and MI6 is also, it reveals a lot about what the hell the Cold War was all about. It really wasn't about communism versus capitalism at all. There was something else. So here's an image of something that I think the Russians pay a lot of attention to, not enough Westerners do, in terms of looking at the growth of not just the European Union, but also NATO, that's been expanding onto Russia's border increasingly, with a policy that Putin first started calling out in 2007, known as full spectrum dominance. That's an ideology of military encirclement of Russia and the installation of long-range ballistic missiles, also around the Pacific theater as well, where there's a NATO expansion that has been attempted now for many years, with THAAD missile shields in South Korea and major forward installations and basing in Japan. That's something I think everyone here is very aware of, which is very much tied to both a plan to attack Russia as well as China. with the concept that a first strike is possible with no retaliation, or at least minimal collateral damage of some European countries and some Asian so-called allies of the Anglo-American axis, but not really. It's still a winnable thing in the minds of some of these game theoreticians. And of course, there's NATO. And the parallels to what was done, this is a 1933 image of the mapping of Germany's expansion around Russia. The Russians know their history. They know what this is. And then to take another critical eye to it from another angle, just to look at the asymmetrical warfare that's been unleashed to weaken the Eurasian development, the idea of the greater Eurasian partnership, which involves, since Zbigniew Brzezinski really unleashed this back in the 70s, but it's been a continuous ideology through Desert Storm, through the 9/11 age, of the utilization of CIA-backed groupings that may not even be aware all the time that they're getting money from the CIA or directives, like, groups directly connected to ISIS that were turned into, kind of like Middle Eastern variations of the Banderite, Nazi terrorists that have been groomed in Eastern Europe, in especially Ukraine, but also in Estonia and a variety of other Baltic states. There's been an effort to just undermine any country that might offer some form of economic peace and stability, whether Syria, Libya, you name it, and also just spread general chaos to keep Eurasia destabilized, at war with itself, and thus incapable of developing the sorts of things we actually see now coming out of especially the Chinese and the Russians. But I mean, this has won over a huge amount of allies into the Multipolar Alliance. This is the Belt and Road Initiative, or at least one of the main arteries of a very flexible grand design for the Belt and Road Initiative, with not just Eurasian integration, but also African integration. Like, this is something that the African Union has embraced wholeheartedly, especially through the Africa Agenda 2063 program that calls for high-speed rail development with 3 north-south rail corridors and 6 east-west rail, in some cases high-speed networks. Tanzania is moving ahead very fast with this. Ethiopia and Djibouti already have built up a standard gauge rail system that could easily extend through a tunnel or a bridge or both into Yemen and the broader Saudi Arabia, which is also developing increasingly an orientation towards the BRICS with UAE and with Iran. So there's this beautiful orientation towards looking for a paradigm of cooperation and long-term thinking. We saw it coming out of the St. Petersburg Economic Summit this past week. About 56 nations have expressed their intention to join the BRICS and the broader multipolar alliance. Turkey, being also a NATO member, has had the foreign minister last week say that Turkey wants to join. Thailand. But again, many, many others. So here's another expression of this taken from the Cradle magazine, featuring the North-South International Transportation Corridor that involves India, Iran, Russia, but also about 13 other countries, which is very complementary to the Belt and Road Initiative. That also involves an extension beyond St. Petersburg into the Arctic, which was a big focus of the St. Petersburg Forum as well, is recognizing the Northwest Passage or above Russia as being an alternative to increasingly the Suez Canal, which will increase shipping freight traffic by 5-fold by 2030, with a huge orientation towards the Far Eastern Arctic development. With, I think, Shoigu recently made an announcement calling for 5 new advanced cities in Russia's Far East and Arctic. These are very bold. Again, you have to have a 25, 30-year future orientation. It also involves finding points of harmony in both the private and public sector, with nations like Japan, South Korea, who are big investors in Russia's east, along with China, along with other countries that the Anglo-American axis would like otherwise those Pacific nations to be at war with China around. There's points of great communion there that could put out a lot of fuses. So that's the dynamic of the current living history.
Matt, isn't there a competitive route through Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Israel to that one that's going through Iran? I forgot what's called.
There's the Basra at the bottom there. You see a the yellow line that goes from Iran down through from Basra to Shalamshe on the Iraqi side, which already has a 1,500 kilometer rail grid that has been brought into disuse, but they're rehabilitating it. That could also extend into Syria. And then Saudi Arabia, with the help of the Chinese, is building already a pretty big high-speed rail network across. It's the Pan-Arabian high-speed rail line. It's 2,400 kilometers. It's really big. It's part of the Belt and Road Initiative, but it's not like either or. I think right now the ideal would be for both of these southern, central, and northern Belt and Road lines to be built up. Of course, a lot of Western geopoliticians like the CFR, they try to frame these things as if they're all like, they do a lot of Freudian projection where they try to make it seem like everybody in Eurasia is fighting everybody else for territorial dominance. And I don't think that that's so much the case at this point. But yeah, it's very flexible. I don't know what's going to happen first.
Matt, if you prefer, if you like, you can go to slideshow option in this.
I guess I can, eh? Yeah, I was a little insecure because I couldn't remember what slides come next, but I'll just go with the flow. We'll just see what happens. All right, designs.
Yeah, because you can proceed.
Where's the slide? Here it is. Got it. Yeah, I just tended to forget what I put in what order, so I was cheating a little bit, but that's okay. It's good. This keeps me on my game. All right. So I alluded to this already, but let's just make this visceral. I think everyone here is probably familiar with this to varying degrees, but why not, right? I mean, it's worth being reminded that, you know, people like Lieutenant General Alfred Heusinger, who was for a period Hitler's chief of staff, found his new employment, should have probably been hung at Nuremberg, found his next job as the head of NATO. You know, that's him there on the right underneath the NATO symbol. NATO itself was created in 1949, but the ball was already being set in motion to bypass the UN Security Council as early as 1946. Because, you know, Russia and China are not supposed to have a say in Hobbesian unilateral imposition of will to power over the weak. So, you know, NATO had to be created as some way to get around the Russia-China influence within the UN. This is a little bit from my wife's book, The Empire in Which the Black Sun Never Set, on the Birth of International Fascism. It's a really good book. So Cynthia just has a whole chapter going through in detail the various NATO commanders that were given very high positions of influence within the NATO infrastructure after World War II, who were all unreconstructed fascists, mostly Nazi, but there were some Italian and French fascists as well, obviously thrown in for good measure. Of those, I won't go into their bios, but you have, you know, Johann Steinhoff, who was the chairman of the NATO Military Committee from 71 to 74, also acting commander of the Allied Forces Central Europe and NATO from 65 to 66. Johann Kielmanzegg, who is general staff officer to the High Command of the Wehrmacht, became NATO's commander-in-chief, Allied Forces Central Europe from 67 to 68. Anyway, it's a big list, and I think that something like, last I remember, it's like 16 high-level commanders in charge of the Central and Eastern European Command of NATO were unreconstructed Nazis. That's not a little thing. And then on top of that, you got, you know, the obvious case of Reinhard Gehlen and his entire network of thousands of hardcore Nazis that were mass murderers who had been, you know, this is, of course, Hitler's primary intelligence chief, who was made the head of West German intelligence under Alan Dulles. Bandera was working with him for a period as well. Mykola Lebed, the other organization for Ukrainian nationalist leader, was brought immediately to the United States, where he basically was assigned to write textbooks for Ukrainian expats about how Stalin was actually worse than Hitler. That Mykola Lebed, who worked with the CIA and a CIA cutout group up until his death in '88. So, you know, this is a big deal. My wife in her book, she has a chapter on this as well. It's useful that there's that the NATO symbol itself is not simply some compass, but was a direct take from the Rose of the Winds, the Rose des Vents, the Compass Rose, which was a French anti-communist secret army established in 1947, highly Freemasonic, tied to French Marxist Freemasons. NATO's first headquarters being established in France, which de Gaulle later kicked out, even though he had to suffer or nearly get killed like 30 times by General Schall and the other Organisation de l'Armée Secrète, the secret army forces that were trying to maintain and defend the heritage of France as a colonial empire, which de Gaulle was in total opposition to. And because de Gaulle was smart, he had good intelligence support. That's part of the thing that you need to have that I think JFK did not have. He was able to avoid a lot of these assassination attempts. He was able to kick out Permindex as well from France when they were caught behind at least 2 of the assassination attempts, and they found their basing in both South Africa thereafter and Montreal, Canada, which was also behind the JFK murder. I got a whole book on that. So that's just for a word for context. And we could talk about more of this if people want in the Q&A in terms of the Operation Gladio and things that I'm sure everyone here is probably familiar with. So to get at Gouzenko, because that's in my mind, I didn't forget. The point of this thing is to get at, well, what was the Gouzenko hoax and how is it being replayed again today, 80 years later? Got to understand Canada's anti-fascist movement. The Mackenzie Papineau Battalion, there's a photograph of some of the fighters. It was a very valiant grouping of Canadian volunteers who fought with the Spanish Republicans against the fascists, against Franco, when there was the Franco coup in 36 and a civil war was carried out immediately. There was a huge Canadian contingent, very, very brave people. You had also American contingents too, being sent down with the Lincoln brigades, working very closely together. And some of them got in. A lot of these people couldn't get support by the Canadian government to receive passports to fly or visas to get over to Spain, and had to get in kind of illegally through different networks that would acquire counterfeit passports that would allow these men to fly over and to get into Spain to carry out the fight. But this is going to come into play into this story. We'll skip that. I mean, I alluded to this earlier. Eugenics obviously was a big deal in Canada as well. Across the United States, we had 2 of our provinces in Canada that had adopted eugenics, the forced sterilization of the unfit, those who are deemed morally or mentally unfit to breed and pollute the human gene pool. We had sterilization laws in Alberta and BC, 30 US states before Hitler did it. And a lot of these were, again, being funded. The science of this, which was a mathematical statistical science, it wasn't based on any real science, was funded by the Josiah Macy Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, a lot of the foundations that exerted a huge amount of influence after World War II, that sponsored Mengele in Germany. So these are just some of the propaganda posters, both in Germany as well as in the United States. And again, it was a big deal. It was huge also in Quebec, where I'm based. Quebec was had a Catholic fascist orientation at the time. Under well, I'll say a word about that. Here's an image of Franco and Hitler. Everyone knows that Franco had an alliance. He stayed neutral, but was generally allied, obviously, to the Axis. There was a huge eugenics movement in Spain. Mass murderous. I mean, there over 200,000 at least people were executed in the White Terror between 36 and 39. Concentration camps were used, forced labor camps, just total disappearance of any intellectual who was questioning the legitimacy of fascism was disappeared. The same sort of thing was done all over South America under Operation Condor, when other Nazis were brought in via the rat line from Germany into Latin America to advise increasingly right-wing governments to carry out murder campaigns against their own population, as their nations were brought under the captivity of the IMF, the World Bank, and the Bechtel, and the other multinational corporations that were being used to re-exert a global fascist influence that had been subverted because of the Russians, the Chinese, and I would also say FDR and the Allies, who played a role, a very useful role in opposition to other fascists within Wall Street, within England. But that New World Order agenda was subverted, so they had to do it again, which is where a lot of these Nazis were put back to work in the 60s and 70s, advising hard right governments in Latin America and beyond. I alluded to,
Matt,
yes, sir.
do you know if an organization called the World Anti-Communist League that Chiang Kai-shek set up, I think in 1966, that had branches all throughout Latin America, was involved in that?
Oh, I'm sure it was, but I haven't looked at it too specifically. I mean, Chiang Kai-shek is terrible, terrible. I mean, yeah. I won't go. That's a whole class unto itself, and I can actually recommend a really good speaker on Chiang Kai-shek if you guys want one down the line. But anyway, here, yeah, probably. So, here we have a fellow named Oswald Mosley. Sir Oswald Mosley was a leading British Fabian, somebody who was also a theosophist, a follower of Annie Besant, who was the head of the British Union of Fascists, hardcore eugenicist, and was supposed to be was almost the prime minister, could have been the prime minister of England, had, Edward VIII, the Nazi king, that guy, been able to maintain his stronghold. And Edward VIII, at a certain point, there was a fight within the elites within England between one faction that was a little troubled by the fact that their Hitler project wasn't sort of going as they had planned for it to go. Hitler was supposed to be a servant of the empire, a battering ram against Russia. Somebody was going to be expected to take orders ultimately and be provided a jurisdiction under a global world empire of fascist, zones of control. Japan was supposed to have their influence. Japan was going to be promised China as their slave colony. Germany was promised, the under human Slavs as their slave colony of Russia. You had the Trotskyists as well, as a giant fifth column in Russia, doing business with both Japanese and German fascists, trying to undermine the Stalinists. I think Grover First probably said a word or two about that in previous presentations to you guys. But the British had their own thing. There was, again, this fellow, this king, was very close to Lloyd George, was close to Neville Chamberlain. There's a big chunk of the Round Table movement of the Fabians who are still for the idea that, maybe even though Hitler's not working out the way we imagined him to be working out, we could still obviously work with him. We put so much effort into it. And yet another faction within the oligarchy that basically said, no, we don't want to accept being junior partner to a new world order. We're the top dog. And so, that was the faction around Leo Amory. Churchill was like, they weren't good people, but they were of the view that no, we have to eat some humble pie, put down the Frankenstein monster, live to fight another day, regroup. Doesn't make them good, just means that they're a little bit more into their self-interest. You see certain faction lines similarly today being drawn, I think, as well, that the plan isn't working out the way it was supposed to in 1991, 92, when the New World Order was looking like it was a done deal. And all of a sudden, since China came out with the Belt and Road Initiative, since you have all of these other incredible developments, things are not working out according to plan. So there's evidence of all sorts of infighting as well within the upper Anglo-American establishment. We could talk about that later, but just to keep the flow going. There's Neville Chamberlain, obviously, with Hitler after signing the Munich Betrayal, the Munich Pact, that granted Hitler the ability to expand his empire into both, well, first it was Austria, but then Czechoslovakia. The British, especially Montague Norman, the Bank of England, were very, very responsible for helping to get Hitler as much of the Czechoslovakian gold as humanly possible, as well as basically take control of very strategic zones that would encroach upon Russia. Poland was done a little sloppy by Hitler. I think that's what forced some of these groupings to do a bit of a regime change inside of Britain. That's the king I was mentioning, and that's Queen Elizabeth learning the family fascist ropes there, doing a Hitler salute. And Canada. So Adrian Arcand was the head of a certain party called the National Unity Party, the Quebec fascists. And he was known as these are the blue shirts, black and white picture, but they're wearing blue shirts. They were pretty big. I mean, in Quebec in the 30s and 40s, there were marches down St. Catherine Street, huge rallies, just like there was in the United States in Madison Square Garden from 1934 to 39. There were tons of Madison Square Garden rallies, Nazi rallies featuring imagery of George Washington and the swastika. It was big. It was big. And a lot of this was getting patronage by the Vanderbilt family, the JP Morgans, a lot of the same financiers that were backing such think tanks like the American Liberty League, the Lamont Morgan Liberty League, that was also behind keeping the United States out of World War II for as long as possible, with the idea that, you know, we can have an alliance with the Nazis, you know. And that was basically part of the agreement, was that these American Nazis, these American fascists who are running Wall Street, were going to be taking control of a big chunk of South America as American fascists. That wasn't agreed upon by everybody in the American establishment, which is why I think they had to try to do the business coup with Smedley Butler a little bit earlier. Roosevelt was pretty brilliant, but I think also a little bit naive to the nature of this thing. So his early death in April 1945 resulted in a big chunk of these groups taking control, having way too much influence over the UN conference in San Francisco, way more influence than they were supposed to have. A lot of these groups, again, in Canada, I mentioned on the Quebec level, where you have a Catholic fascist cultural dynamic that was being groomed. Pierre-Elliott Trudeau was a big supporter, by the way, of Adrien Arcand when he was still a student, before he joined the Fabian Society and was groomed under Harold Lasky and sent back to Canada. But you had on the federal level a pro-eugenics movement called the League of Social Reconstruction, set up by 5 Rhodes Scholars. That's an image of those Rhodes Scholars. One of them on the right is named Escott Reed. He was actually I wrote a chapter on this, but he's the founding father of NATO. 2 years before there was NATO, he was already setting out the guidelines for it with some people in London. The guy in the middle is F.R. Scott. He was the handler of Pierre-Elliott Trudeau in Ottawa, working at the Privy Council office. There's a few others there. Anyway, they set up an entity that had it was known as the Fabian Society of Canada. That's the League of Social Reconstruction, and the political party that it created in 1933 was called the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation. In 1960, it changed its name to the NDP Party, the Orange Party. And a lot of these creeps took over control of the Liberal Party during the 1958 to 63 period. And then the Liberal Party, coming out of 1963 onward, was pretty much infested by these roundtable. These are, for those who don't know, the Rhodes Scholars are sort of it's a cult. It's a ideological cult of initiates who had been inducted into or brainwashed in the halls of Oxford and sent back into different parts of the world Commonwealth to bring about Cecil Rhodes's vision that he expounded in his 7th will, or actually in all of his wills, frankly, calling for a global church of the British Empire and the renewal of the British Empire and the reconquest of the United States. So it was done using a very slow, long-term method of penetration of everything with influence. So in Canada, it had its own peculiar characteristics. Their ambition to create a scientifically managed, technocratic, eugenics-based society, which was it's all different flavors of fascism at the end of the day, this thing. They nominally call themselves socialists, but I think everyone has noticed that there's not a one-size-fits-all. These were fake socialists. They despised the poor. They really didn't like labor. So they were the Fabian socialists are a real perversion. They're not really the real deal. And they were always at war with another grouping called the Labor Progressive Party of Canada. And this is where the Gouzenko affair is going to come into play. The Labor Progressive Party was a political party that was the enemy of the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, fighting for who would have influence over the workers of Canada, the unions, the poor. Originally, before they were called the Labor Progressive Party, they were the Communist Party of Canada. And again, it was a hard battle between these two factions. And I think that what I've noticed that the Trotskyists largely were expressed or represented by this Fabian Society grouping of Rhodes Scholars. FDR, Mackenzie King. Yeah, I won't have to say much about that. But, you know, there was an idea of a U.S., Russia, China alliance for international New Deals. So the type of massive industrialization and large-scale infrastructure that characterized the Tennessee Valley Authority, the rural electrification projects of the 1930s, the Hoover Dam project, you know, the Grand Coulee Dam, all of these, the St. Lawrence Seaway projects as well, that also benefited Canada. A lot of these were very, very large-scale projects. They involved like national credit emitted through pseudo-national banks like the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which FDR was able to utilize like his own national bank to bypass the Federal Reserve. And it really uplifted not just the productive powers of labor, but the quality of minds of the people living in such backwards, illiterate zones like Tennessee, where there was like a crazy bad illiteracy rating of like 80% illiteracy in 1932. But by 1953, when it became, you know, this zone, because of the hydroelectric dams, the mass abundant electricity, and other secondary and tertiary infrastructure built up, it resulted in a literacy of over 95%. So it was a huge transformation of the cognitive powers. It became an aerospace hub because all of a sudden you could produce a lot of aluminum cheaply. So aerospace obviously is a no-brainer. And African leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, who were coming to the United States, studying how the U.S. was able to miraculously do that while carrying out the Lend-Lease program, providing vital supplies to Stalin during the war, while also doing all of these other things so that Africa could learn to do it there. You had delegations from India studying these things to think, how could this be done as well to provide for the economic liberation of India? You had people from South America studying this thing. So again, it was a beautiful idea. And like Stalin told FDR's son, Elliot, who was his personal aide after his father died, a very mysterious death, and there was never an autopsy. So anybody who says, oh, it was a natural death and it was like an aneurysm or whatever, bullshit. I'm sorry for my language, but they don't know what they're talking about. There was never an autopsy. And Stalin said his belief that it was Churchill's people who killed your father. And this was published by Elliot years later. Mackenzie King was a mixed bag. I think he meant well, but he was stupid. He was receiving, you know, he had spirit mediums coming to Rideau Hall in Ottawa, giving him messages from his dead dog and mom about what policies Canada should take up. So the guy was soft, but his heart was in the right place. I think he was genuinely inspired by the idea of a world of win-win cooperation based on the international extension of the New Deal as a new way of doing things based on mutual cooperation. And again, just ending hunger, ending poverty, kind of like what was outlined by the four freedoms of Roosevelt. And that was supposed to be, I think, the basis of what the United Nations was supposed to be, not what it became, but what it was supposed to be. Involved the actualization of the four freedoms. FDR's vice president for a period for his third term in office was a very interesting guy. Again, like Mackenzie King, the Prime Minister of Canada, had some intellectually weak spots that made his judgment not always reliable. You know, he had a penchant for seeking advice from certain theosophists that he naively thought were trustworthy, which I don't think were trustworthy ever. But despite that, I think he again was a mensch. He was a mensch. He hated imperialism. He had a certain sense of what a world that would be anti-imperial looked like. And he also understood the nature of a big chunk of the U.S. deep state that was working to undermine this beautiful vision. And he wrote in Soviet Mission Asia in 1944, before the blood of our boys is scarcely dry on the field of battle, these enemies of peace try to lay the foundations for World War III. These people must not succeed in their foul enterprise. We must offset their poison by following the policies of Roosevelt and cultivating the friendship of Russia in peace as well as in war. It's a great pamphlet. It's very expensive to buy online these days, but he was potent in clearly identifying the nature of the beast. And I just have one more, I think, useful quote from him. where he's very astutely warning that fascism in the post-war inevitably will push steadily for Anglo-Saxon imperialism and eventually for war with Russia. Already American fascists are talking and writing about this conflict and using it as an excuse for their internal hatreds and intolerances towards certain races, creeds, and classes. And this he wrote in 1945, right when he was getting fired. He had been, at this point, there was a bit of an internal coup within the Democratic Party. Harry Truman was brought in to replace him. He could see where the winds were blowing. Harry Truman made him Secretary of Commerce. But when he continued to warn of American fascist takeover and World War III with Russia, and was trying to revive the positive relations with Stalin, he was fired. He was labeled a red commie, as were many other allies, including people like Harry Dexter White, the first head of the IMF. The IMF, I think, was supposed to be a very different institution than what it turned out to be. Originally, it was supposed to be that conduit that would extend large-scale credit for the development needs of nations aspiring to actualize their nominal political independence, but to do it now economically, that was not permitted to happen. So again, Dexter White was labeled a red commie. It was a big list, and there was a big purge of the U.S. patriotic establishment. There's one last effort. Oliver Stone did a great movie going through a little bit of this, but Paul Robeson, who figures quite prominently in this history of America. And again, my Clash of the Two Americas Volume 2 gets at his story quite a bit. He was campaigning. He basically took a year off of singing for the most part and campaigned for Henry Wallace when he was running for the Progressive Labor Party, and the Progressive Party in 1948, as was Harry Dexter White, was campaigning for Wallace and many others. That didn't work out. You know, you had the FBI apparatus. Hoover played a role in subverting Wallace's campaign internally. There was a lot going against them, but it was a very valiant effort to revive some real authentic nationalism at that time. And little timeline here. So, as I mentioned, Wallace was flushed early. I think he was around, actually, I don't remember when in 45 he was flushed, or 46 he was fired completely from the government. But so the thing I want to talk about is the Gouzenko affair that was launched on September 7th, 1945. This was 2 weeks before Truman dissolves the OSS. It was a little bit before. I mean, soon after that, you have things go crazy. Churchill delivers his Iron Curtain speech, calling for basically the Iron Curtain to fall, separating the world between, you know, communist free countries versus communist authoritarian countries versus capitalist free democracies. That was going to be the new Manichaean dualism that was supposed to like shape the balance of powers going forward, especially after the nuclear bomb. You had the same day Churchill establishes the USA-UK Signals Agreement that becomes the basis of what is known as the Five Eyes. That special relationship is poison, but it allows for a complete takeover. And FDR had already warned of Churchill's people wishing to take control via the State Department of the government while he was still alive to his son, Elliot. And that's largely what happened. A lot of these agencies were Rhodes Scholars. Again, the Rhodes Scholar outlet in America was known as the Council on Foreign Relations. That was set up in 1921 as the American branch of the British, what's known as the Royal Institute for International Affairs, which itself was basically the Cecil Rhodes Milner Roundtable Group. So that's the CFR. It was never an American institution as such, and it was always staffed with Fabians and Rhodes Scholars, just like the Fabian Society of Canada. It was always a collusion of the two agencies. The CIA was created, 47. And then you have the NSC 75 report calling for basically the U.S. to protect British interests everywhere where there once was a British colony. Now the idea was, well, since Britain is nominally letting a lot of its colonies go free or become independent, they might become communist. So it's in America's interest to protect the British Empire's economic influence over those countries. So that's actually a self-conscious program brought in by the U.S. establishment. So a lot of this insanity, the destruction of this beautiful potential for a U.S.-Russia-China alliance that would drive global progress, it had a lot of hope and allies around in Canada. Some of the most potent voices who were thus targeted, just like Henry Wallace and FDR's key allies were targeted in America. You had a crazy witch hunt. There was an inquisition set up in Canada that largely triggered the Cold War. And this, still a lot of Americans, a lot of Canadians had a lot of positive feelings for the Russians. The Russians, it was understood. People watched Frank Capra's Why We Fight series. Like there was an appreciation that Russia had sacrificed so much, had carried the weight of most of World War II on their own shoulders. 28 million Russians had died in the fight against fascism. So there was a lot of positive feelings and admiration towards the Russian spirit in those days. That had to be crushed, and a major propaganda media war was launched to do that. And the initiating thing was served sort of two purposes. Number one, it did what I just said. It helped shift the psyche of the American people and the Canadians and the British to become anti-Russian, thus justifying the new age of surveillance states, the new type of management under Cold War secrecy with Nazis working in harmony with the Anglo-American and Canadian establishment. People were not supposed to look at or talk about those things anymore, or else you might lose your security clearance if you were working for the government. You might lose your job if you were working for a school, if you brought any of these things up in public. So, I mean, this became like a CIA, FBI run dictatorship in America of a surveillance state of people ratting on their neighbors. In Canada, like I said, these three figures, there was more, but they're really prominent. You had Member of Parliament Sam Carr on the left. You have Tim Buck, who was Labor Progressive. They're all Labor Progressive Party leaders. And sorry, Fred Rose is on the right. Sam Carr was a Labor Progressive Party national organizer. Tim Buck, similar. And Fred Rose was a Montreal Member of Parliament. And they were very outspoken against not just the Wall Street backing of Adrien Arcand. By the way, Adrien Arcand was the Quebec representative for the federal party of R.B. Bennett. R.B. Bennett was the Canadian prime minister between 1930 and 34. And he was the Conservative Party prime minister. And his lieutenant in Quebec was Adrien Arcand, the Quebec Nazi. He had after he was ousted by Mackenzie King in 35. He lived out his days as a British viscount in London. Obviously, that's always been his allegiance. So the support for fascism was very deeply enmeshed in the Canadian federal establishment. They had to be targeted and taken down. So that was the other aspect of the Gouzenko affair. So what was the Gouzenko affair? Oops. So that's Igor Gouzenko behind a stupid bag over his head. That was the way he was kind of marketed to the population. He came out of he was a 25-year-old cipher clerk at the Russian embassy. His background, I'm not too veiled in a little bit of mystery, but the kid basically had very low-level security clearance. He was a clerk. And as the story goes, and as most Canadians have been brainwashed, there's been, CBC movies to popularize this. It's all a lie. But it's been turned into sort of like a national sacred story that it's almost like Holodomor. You can't even question it. It's just you. There's a big electric fence around the minds of Canadians, especially. So as the story goes, he left one night on September 6th, 1945, from the Russian embassy and ran to the RCMP with a load of secret documents that he stole because he just loved Western freedom so much. And amongst those documents were lists, handwritten telegrams from General Zubetov, documenting the different code names for a variety of Russian agents embedded within the Canadian and American and British bureaucracies. and not just bureaucracies, but just general a lot of them happen to be disproportionately members of the Progressive Labor Party of Canada, or the Labor Progressive Party of Canada. And there were other documents too. We were told that there was like 108 documents he took. Nobody ever saw them, by the way, but we, we believe our authorities. So he goes and he gets protection from the RCMP, and he disappears for about 6 months. He disappears, and then in February he reemerges, and all of a sudden a royal commission is created to crack down on the Russian disinformation and other agents embedded within Canada. Before saying what this is, and this is the Gouzenko Commission, is this royal commission. He disappears. It's important to know where he disappeared to. He disappeared to a place called Camp X, near Oshawa in Ontario, near Ottawa. It was a complex that was set up in 1941 before the U.S. officially entered the war, and it was set up in Canada, overseen by Sir William Stevenson from the British Security, the BSC. So basically, Sir William Stevenson, who Churchill called his intrepid, sets this thing up, and it's designed to be a training school for training American intelligence around the black arts of British psychological warfare, assassinations, covert propaganda, forgeries, how do you utilize forgeries, a whole bunch of things like that. But so the dark arts that Britain had honed so well over centuries of maintaining an empire. They were like, we have to train the Americans now to do some of this stuff. And so Canada became the bridge to make it happen. And so thousands of members, selected members, not everyone was granted the privilege of getting trained in these dark arts, but certain people who fit a certain profile criteria from the FBI's Division 5, which is sort of the international division of the FBI, as well as the OSS, the Dulles crowd at the OSS, not the Patriots who understood what the synarchy was, but specifically the Dulles crowd were brought in, trained, integrated into the British security apparatus. And this is where Igor Guzenko was living for 6 months. And oh, there it is. That's my fact sheet. See? Okay, so I think I just said most of that stuff there. Yes, I said all of that. David Stafford wrote a book called On Camp X. It's a decent book, where he writes within the book, Stevenson vigorously opposed King's view. So, okay, I should say this first. So William Lyon Mackenzie King, the prime minister, was still in favor of keeping the FDR dream alive of establishing good relations with Russia and China based on big development projects. So Mackenzie King, that was his orientation. He didn't. So anyway, Stevenson, however, vigorously opposed King's view. Like SIS, headquarters in London, the British Security Cooperation for most of the war had operated a counter-espionage section to keep an eye on communist subversion. He was convinced, even before the Guzenko affair, that the BSC could provide the nucleus of a post-war intelligence organization in the Western Hemisphere, which is exactly what it was. The cipher clerk's defection provided him a golden opportunity. So this became the catalyzer, the trigger for a lot. So wait, before I do the next slide here, let me just do a stop share. I'll do a quick stop share and then I'll reshare. During this Inquisition, the War Measures Act was extended after the war, which allowed for detentions, so federal detentions of anybody who was seen as a subversive incommunicado, the removal of any habeas corpus, the right to have access to a legal advisor or access even to your family, the ability to carry out psychological torture. These were all like okay under the the extension of the War Measures Act, and it was Royal Commission Order 411 that extended that under the Gouzenko affair. And any RCMP officer or federal person involved in this case it was made illegal for them to speak publicly about what they knew of any abuses of justice during this case, under threat of going to jail for well over a decade. And the only person who was given free rein to speak to as much of the press as they wanted to was Igor Gouzenko, who was charging upwards of $1,000 per interview he was given. He was getting book deals left and right. So he had high-level influence who gave him like full access and money galore to just like come up and creatively talk about the evils of Russia. Again, a lot of people had a very naive belief in the authorities of Canada at the time. They went along with it. Now, there was about 26 arrests. Again, most of them Labour Progressive Party leaders who were arrested during this time. Back to the slideshow. The very fact. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Just to break in, we've gone for about an hour.
Okay, I'll wrap it up.
All
right.
Go on, just to remind you.
Yeah, I'm just pulling up the, I'm getting to the punchline here. So the very fact that these men were given prison sentences. So of the 26 people arrested, put through psychological torture for months,
this is about
under secret inquisitions. They were not allowed to see the evidence presented about them. They were not allowed to have, again, lawyers. Of those 26, 10 of them got jail terms. And the very fact that these men got jail terms, Tim Buck, Fred Rose, especially they got 7 years each. Sam Carr got 7 years. The very fact that they got jail terms was enough evidence in the minds of the people of Canada that they must have been bad. However, when you look at, well, why did they get jail terms? It wasn't for anything that Gouzenko had claimed that they did. It was only because their jail terms were entirely for having assisted in acquiring passports for Canadians to fight in the Louis Papineau Mackenzie battalion against Franco's fascists. That's why they got the jail terms that they got, not because of anything else. So again, was the evidence true? After the evidence was declassified in 1984 or 85, a lot of reporters, historians went to the National Archives to see these declassified. Screen. I accidentally stopped my screen sharing. They went to the National Archives to try to catch to read these declassified reports, where finally they would be able to see what was it that Gouzenko had presented, had they stole from the Russian embassy, and there was nothing there, nothing there. And so one very good article that I read from 85 by William Rubin goes through his experience. He's like, I finally looked at all the microfilms. I spent hours going through all of these microfilms that were declassified. And what he found, well, he wrote it here. He said he basically found recipe lists, phone books, resumes. There was no evidence of anything. There was no handwritten letters. That apparently was destroyed by the Canadian authorities after the sentencing. They destroyed the handwritten notes. The apparent 108 secret documents from the Russian embassy were destroyed along the way. There was nothing there except random pieces of paper. And Rubin writes, well, what is one to make of this jumble? With no indication as to when any of the exhibits were obtained by the RCMP, how they related to espionage or any wrongdoing, and for the most part, no indication of when they were placed in evidence at the hearings, it is impossible to determine their significance, authenticity, or relationship to other evidence. So again, nothing there. But it created a psychological hysteria, and it justified the creation or the population's acquiescence to something like the creation of the Iron Curtain, the special relationship with England, the support for NATO, which never should have existed in the first place, and so much other evil that was done in the name of freedom. So yeah, that's the sort of thing people could obviously draw their own parallels to how this formula is being reapplied once again in our current world. So yeah, I'll just leave it there. That was the punchline.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Yeah, you attempted valiantly to cover a history of very complex history. Before we go to the question and answer, I want to just make a couple of announcements. Next time, our speaker will be Raj Sahai, who will speak on the recent Indian elections, or the recent Indian elections, and give an analysis of that. Tentatively, also the following month, we have Graham Harrington, who will speak on now I forget what Laos, the socialism in Laos. June 30th, from the U.S. Peace Council, Bahman Azad will speak on Iran, multipolarity, and imperialism. And then on July 7th, Greg Godells will speak on a very timely subject, the U.S. presidential election and the threat of fascism. You can find out all this information on our website, mycssmarks.org, plus links to previous programs. Most of our programs for the last 4 or 5 years that we've been doing on Zoom are posted on the links to them are posted on our website. And finally, on our website, ICSSmarks.org, you can donate money to the work of ICSS, and particularly this program, which we're now attempting to expand the scope of, put on more solid technological basis, and reach a larger audience, which I think will be very valuable. So with that, I'm going to start the question and answers and comments. Please keep your comments to 2 minutes, and ask Matt to keep to a single question each time, so that we can get as many questions as we can. And Matt will answer each question at a time. So for now, we have Michael H., followed by Janet Coburn. Let's go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, my question is about Venona, the transcripts that the FBI had access to of Soviet transmissions from 1940 to 1948 that supposedly was the source of a lot of the different agents, double agents or whatever, that were working behind the scenes, and how that would have played into what Guzenko was talking about.
Well, in my assessment of FBI methodologies, and especially like, the transcripts that were created by Hoover or sanctioned by Hoover to prove that MLK was an orgy-going, abusive psychopath, they kind of make a lot of things up. So it's hard to say, because one of the techniques of this psyop approach has been to just make up forgeries, acting like official documents are official, but they're actually just made up. So unless you got something harder than simple transcripts, I tend to, at this point, I'm so jaded by the manipulators of the West that I tend to label it as questionable evidence that was probably made up as forgeries to get a political effect. That's where I'm at.
Thank you. Okay, next is Janet Coburn, followed by Richard Wright and Raj. Go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you, Matt. Wow, I'm blown away. So my question has to do with the Zionist project, and how does that fit into the whole picture that you described, if it does, which I assume it does.
Oh yeah. Well, that's a big one, eh? That's not a little question. That's a big question. Okay. All right. Well, so there's a number of ways I could approach that. Okay. So because if I take it down a certain angle, it requires a lot of unfolding. So I'll try to do this. So Zionism as a whole is a synthetic concoction that grew out of a Jesuit British foreign policy agenda in the early 19th century. That's actually that's my take. Is that there was an idea that came out of Lord Shaftesbury, who was the head of a major he's sort of known as the father of modern Zionism, in a serious way, who had this interpretation of scripture based on a belief that the end times would be initiated once the Jews were all brought in and Solomon's temple was rebuilt in the Holy Land. And a lot of this had his relationship to certain Templar myths, like they were known as the Knights of Solomon's Temple. Part of that society, that Gnostic order, was geared around this weird Kabbalistic idea. There's this occult belief structure that by rebuilding the third temple on a certain zone, you can sort of initiate some major change in humanity. It gets weird when you start looking at like the inner belief structure of some of these groupings. But that somehow involved convincing all the Jews to go there again, based on a certain type of reading of various scriptures. Anyway, they made a whole thing about this. And this other guy, Darby, John Nelson Darby, was a follower and worked closely with Shaftesbury. And Darby created the Darbyite movement, known as the Plymouth Brethren, which is the at the forefront of Zionism, the interpretation of like the hidden rapture idea of Christianity. So he was proselytizing this interpretation in the United States, trying to convince Americans like not to fight to save the Union during the Civil War. He was actually telling them like, no, this is the sign of the end times. You just have to sit on your barn roofs and wait for the rapture. And so he had this movement. A lot of his followers, like Reverend Moody, there's pretty much all of his followers went on to create modern evangelical Christianity that was very much contaminated by this belief that it was the Christian's responsibility to bring about Armageddon, or at least, and initiate or help unfold prophecy. And that involves somehow bringing God's chosen people to the Holy Land. And William Blackstone, who wrote the Blackstone Memorials that, justified the creation of Israel for what's his name? Theodore Herzl. He was a follower of Darby. And so that idea of creating a situation all for the Jews to want to leave Europe and Russia involved making life really hard for the Jews in Europe and Russia. So the fact that you have like a lot of these hard, not like people who went on to support anti-Semitic policies, like Lloyd George, Leo Amory as well, was supportive massively of anti-Semitic policies. Lord Balfour, massive anti-Semite. They were the ones working to create the Balfour Accords with the Round Table Movement and Fabians. But it's like, why were these people who are supportive of Nazism, anti-Semites, also so passionate about creating a state for the Jews in British Mandate Palestine? So it had, I think, multiple levels to why it happened and what its usefulness was. And on the one hand, it was geopolitically very expedient to have like a zone that could be kept very highly volatile in the heartland of where all of these civilizations intersect in Jerusalem. So that's the zone where Africa and Asia and Russia and Europe all intersect in that Middle East zone. So if you can keep that area in constant conflict, it helps keep control of the world island, using Mackinder's terminology. On the other hand, they also, I think, found it useful to grow an organized crime complex, utilizing a variety of criminal enterprises. The Jewish mafia groupings around Marilansky, the Bronfmans, were no small part. I mean, they were a big part of how this worked. So the Bronfmans were already like Samuel Bronfman, which was was brought into Canada during Prohibition, grew his complex with the support of very high-level institutions within the British Empire. He was made a Knight of the Order of Bath, something that's only granted to the highest servants of the empire. His family, Charles Bronfman, Edgar Bronfman, were made privy councillors to the crown in the 60s, 70s. They worked with Maurice Strong and other imperialists during that period of a conversion of Canada into more of an aggressive influence on behalf of empire, and a whole organized crime syndicate that was built up around things that we've now seen, revealed more recently with what Epstein represented around Mossad, which itself had strange Nazi connections to. Unreconstructed Nazis were advising Mossad when it was created in 51. As that's weird, but it makes sense when you look at it from this other standpoint. So part of the maintenance of a global empire, just like what Shanghai Chek built up with the Green Dragon Gang around the drug syndicates, they did the same thing in India. They did it all over South America. They create structures that would allow for massive money laundering, black budgets that would then provide cash for all sorts of asymmetrical warfare operations, terrorist financing, as well as bribery, creating a culture of corruption and bribery within the political class. So but it wasn't something outside of the influence of this intelligence apparatus, as far as I could tell. It seems like it's part of the same thing. It's not different. And it gets into the weird Vatican networks too. They're tied to Gladio. It's strange, but it does make some coherence to it. And ultimately, don't think that Israel, like, if you ask me straight up, I don't think that there is a long-term plan for Israel to be like a forever thing. I think part of it is that they're a disposable part of the chess piece that these pro-Nazi groupings that created Zionism over a century ago always saw it as something useful, but that would ultimately be expendable after a period of conflagration. And that's a whole conversation unto itself. Like it takes a bit of, I mean, Henry Kissinger was asked in 2012, where do you foresee Israel in 10 years? And his answer to the Jerusalem Post was, in 10 years, there will be no Israel. And people were confused by what he meant, because I think they were not in on the joke. But I think the idea has been to get rid of the Arabs and the Jews living there, by getting this sort of ideological thing to grow it up as a monster over the dead bodies of people like Yitzhak Rabin, who is trying to create a more positive relationship based on economic cooperation with Yasser Arafat. So that type of mature thinking of like labor Zionism had to be annihilated, which it was with Rabin's murder. And then you had this other thing, this more like religiously motivated thing around the Jabotinskyites, who were also very close to the Trotskyists, ironically. I don't think that that's a coincidence, who then took control under Bibi Netanyahu and his network of followers of Rabbi Kook. And Rabbi Kook was a Kabbalist, the head of the British man. He was the head Ashkenaz rabbi of British Mandate Palestine, and he was a Kabbalist who wrote a book called Biorot, calling for essentially, people could read it. I cite from his book quite a bit to make my points, but he basically called for world conflagration to usher in a new world order that he believed would coincide with Solomon's Temple, and his followers created all of the yeshivas in the 50s and 60s. He worked closely with Jabotinsky as well. But those yeshivas that produced the radical settler movement, the illegal settler movement, they were all followers who were indoctrinated in his yeshivas, as Benjamin Netanyahu himself is, and his leading groupings. So, yeah, like I said, it gets funky and weird to get into this nasty, weird, like teleological mindset. But yeah, it's religious in a weird, sick way and Kabbalistic. Sorry if that's too much. I tread a lot there.
Well, it's a thing for another whole session.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah. Before we go on, I just want to point out that we're having some, I think, troubles through Zoom with Matt's connection. So, there's nothing we can do about it. Matt is very, very conscientious in having a good technical setup of his own, but we have no control over Zoom. So bear with us.
Could I just ask Matt to would you put your email address in the chat?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Okay. So the next speaker is Richard Wright, followed by Raj, followed by Jean Rule. Go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. We don't, in this country, we don't often get the Canadian connection to the United States geopolitical dynamics, and it is nice that you brought that up. is enlightening, things I didn't realize. As you were talking, there were sort of things that were going through my head that I sort of that you're stimulating. One was like the Rosenbergs here. Joe McCarthy, with his lists and claiming of all the communists that nobody ever, well, in particular, the media never challenged. Or Guantanamo, where we now is still out there. We're still hiding people who are there for no reason other than somebody pointed a finger at them. And so, it struck me that the question that really needs to be asked, to paraphrase somebody else here, and that is, what do we do about this? What is to be done? And I mean, it's all nice and well to have the historic background, but the history does us no good if we do not learn from it and work out a path to further, to defeat that. So could you elaborate on, I'm sure you've thought about things about what we can do to challenge these things, all this secret information that's hidden from us. And so could you maybe talk a little bit about that? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's thank God for Russia and China, and like the fact that there's actual adults in the room capable of making adult decisions. I'm uplifted by the fact that this multipolar potential is manifesting in the way that it is, and it's growing in a creative manner, giving us a lot to work with if we chose to. And I think part of why I try to look at history the way I do is to look at, well, where did this whole New World Order outlook, where did it fail? Like, where did it attempt to manifest itself, and how was it subverted in various moments throughout the past, so that we could like use similar principles once more in our current world. And I think those nations of Eurasia are learning from their past lessons quite well, and aren't falling for traps that are being set for them, that are utilizing national rights to have protectionism, to emit large-scale credit through national banking institutions that are not privatized, like the Chinese have been able to do with their 4 major national banks that have been able to create these miracles, engineering miracles, and that have pulled upwards of 1 billion people out of poverty. That's something that could demonstrate to us like what the sorts of things we were doing when we still had some sanity in our minds a long time ago. But I think we need really and I'm sorry for my choppiness, eh? Like there's a big rainstorm in Canada, right? Or in my neighborhood, which I think is mucking with my connection. I'm super sorry. But there's certain things like our economy is a time bomb. What we thought was a banking system is actually a time bomb, and it's designed to collapse. That's what it was designed to do in 1971 when the Trilateral Commission severed the US dollar from any industrial, measurable, productive system and turned it entirely over towards the speculative markets. And then
this is Richard Wolff from Democracy at Work.
Oh, sorry about that.
All's good.
Go ahead, Matt.
So, they created a consumer economy time bomb built upon speculative bubbles based on derivatives, based on the non-investment into your physical infrastructure, the things that are supposed to keep us alive. So most of the banking system is a bubble that will do nothing but blow. It's going to blow. We're living through the blowout. They want to then use the chaos of the collapse like they did in the Great Depression, but on a bigger scale today, to then carry out not just the wealth transfer, but they want to then bring in a traumatized population to accept things they would normally never accept, like the new type of central bank digital currencies tied to our behavior, so that we will only receive our credits under. It's like a perverse version of what you see in China. Like in China, there's no ideology of a death cult. So that in China, there's like a value of abundance creation, solving problems. So it's not so much of an issue. Whereas these ideologues managing the West want sort of a similar wiring, but one that targets individual behavior. Are you eating your bugs this week? Did you do your ration of, I don't know, running on the treadmill to make your fridge work or something? Like they got a very perverse way of thinking about that which would be tied to a new banking structure, tied to what's known as the Green New Deal. So green credits towards what Mark Carney calls for a $130 trillion investment into, vast green energy grids that are otherwise completely economically non-viable. But that can only happen if they blow out the economy. So rather than wait for that blowout to kill a bunch of people, what we can do is do Glass-Steagall. Like the way this was subverted in 1933 was FDR was able to bring in Glass-Steagall, break up the banks, separate the speculative banks from the clean banks that are tied to the real economy, protect that part of the healthy tissue, rehabilitate the healthy tissue, do the sorts of things that we used to do or that China and Russia are doing today with large-scale investments into the real economy again. We can do those things, but we need to have a movement of people that are bringing that discussion into their town hall meetings, into their networks. And right now, Americans and Canadians are so confused that they're not having these types of conversations. They're not organizing in a coherent manner the way the Labor Progressive Party was able to organize in the 40s and 50s. We're not doing that anymore. So we've lost the ability to organize. That's partly why I look at history the way I do. And there's no easy answer beyond people need to get smarter about this. I don't know.
Thank you. Okay, the next is Raj, followed by Jean Rule and Norma Harrison.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. I learned a lot from your talk. I didn't know many of these things. So how do you see Canada's role today in this global struggle between unipolar world and multipolar world that Russia and China, along with other BRIC members, are trying to create? What role is Canada playing, and how is this going? I mean, Canada has recently accused India of conducting an assassination of a Sikh leader in the western part, and they have recently arrested somebody for it. So I don't know, it might have been true that that's what India did, but how do you see the current role of Canada in this struggle between what I think is G7 versus multipolar world of created called BRICS?
Great question. It's a disaster. I've seen no evidence that any of that is true. Currently, there are public inquiries that ICSS, the Canadian version of the CIA, is overseeing across to try to fuel the fires of anti-China fear and hate in the minds of a lot of Canadians. So these public inquiries that are currently happening are driven around the ICSS claims of China election interference in several of our past elections that put Justin Trudeau into power. Based on anonymous reports, again, anonymous. Nobody's ever seen any of this evidence. It's all anonymous. It's all national security, so nobody gets to see it. I don't believe that there is any evidence other than, one think tank citing another think tank and it becomes a circular thing when you start looking at where this comes from. And I think the same thing, the evidence being used to justify the claim that Modi sanctioned the murder of the Khalistani guy in BC, until I see some actual evidence, which they refuse to give because I don't think there is any, I think the idea is to burn any diplomatic bridges that could otherwise connect us through the private or public sector to countries that are not cooperating with the Great Reset. And maybe up until recently, India was sort of playing along with it a bit more. I think it's become more clear that India doesn't want to go along with what was expected of them. So the new plan is to cut Canada off of those ties to China and India. They don't have to cut us off of Russia because we already cut ourselves off of any ties to Russia over a decade ago. That's not even an issue. But now it's India and China that they're trying to do. So Canada is largely is putting a lot of sand in the gears of multipolarity. That's its current assignment, and it's not a sovereign country. I'll just be straightforward here. One of the disturbing discoveries that I made, and that I think anyone would make when you start looking at this history, reevaluating Canada's history from the earliest days of even 1774 with the Quebec Act, is that we're not a sovereign country. At moments, we were coming closer where we could have qualified ourselves to become an independent country, but we were never able to actualize that. And we've always been a British stronghold in the Americas that have been generally used to subvert progress. Generally, at different times, again, there's exceptions to the rule, but for the most part, the rule has been Canada doesn't play a positive thing. I mean, maybe for a while, we were joining the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, which doesn't even look like we're going to be a member of that for long. But even there, it was largely, as Pierre Elliott Trudeau said when he was asked, like, well, what is your foreign policy philosophy? He said in the early 70s, to create counterweights. And that's always been the middle power position of Canada, is to create counterweights. So when there's a geopolitical, you have to think about it geometrically, right? A geopolitical sort of balance of nuclear terror during the Cold War. And it's a similar sort of idea today that's coming back again. Anytime that the position tilts too favorably to either the communist part of the world or towards the so-called democracies, Canada's job is to sort of all of a sudden go visit and embrace Castro, and do a kumbaya or inversely go and embrace Jimmy Carter and go have a party there and give your support to one side. So just to always create counterweights and otherwise infuse a subversive political ideology that is favorable to the maintenance of empire in any way. So that's unfortunately where we stand at the moment.
Just a clarification, you said the Great Reset. What did you mean by that, Great Reset?
Oh, I just mean the term. It's like a branding that was given. It used to be just called the New World Order, and they just in the last few years, certain freaks at the World Economic Forum gave it a branding called Great Reset, describing the new type of economy and new type of paradigm that would emerge after a period of collapse. Got to reset, turn on and off the system, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
So after the collapse of the world economic system, is that what you mean?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Or controlled demolition of the world economic system.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, next is Gene Rule, followed by Norma Harrison.
Okay, well, Matthew, thank you so much. I mean, this is like a breath of fresh air, cleaning out all the cobwebs and so forth, and looking at the world in a good way, and at present, what's going on with the new Cold War on China and all that. So I really appreciate that. But I'm hoping you could tell me I'm not crazy, because I watched the Memorial Day celebrations, and it's appropriate. There were hundreds of Americans who were killed in the war against fascism, but no mention of the 20 million Russians, Soviet citizens, soldiers that were killed, and people, and also China there too. And then Biden has the gall to say the fight for freedom is continuing in Ukraine, with funding the Bandera Brigade and all these other people. So I just wanted, I hope you'll think I'm not crazy, and I hope you could clarify or kind of verify my sense of reality here. Thank you. But again, thanks. This was such a great talk.
No, you're perfectly sane, obviously.
Thank you. I'll tell my therapist.
Yeah, do please get your money back. No, I mean, we're living in a crazy world, right? I remember when Kishida, the prime minister of Japan, went to Washington, D.C. and gave a speech warning about the threat that Russia poses to the world and a new nuclear war. And it's like, you're the president, you're the head of Japan, coming to the only country that used a nuclear bomb against you, warning about Russia. Like, it's the level of irony is outstanding. No, I know. And I mean, D-Day just also happened, right? The opening up of the Second Front, and everybody's celebrating it is the defeat of fascism. And it's like, well, yeah, we should. But at the same time, it's like that was consciously, that was supposed to happen in 1943, the opening up of the Second Front, if not earlier. And it was specifically, provably British imperial intervention that blocked it, where they said, no, you're not allowed to use our channel. You can't. And they wanted just to drain Russia and have Russia just ultimately be destroyed, and maybe also weaken Germany at the same time. Bonus. And it was when it became apparent that Russia was going to single-handedly win World War II, and then have dominance over what the post-war conditions were going to be. All of a sudden, then it was like, well, maybe we should actually loosen up our position a bit. And I mean, again, completely lost on most Westerners celebrating this thing. Or what was it called? Victory Day is not even Victory Day anymore. They call it Europe Day. It's now Europe Day.
I think, didn't Truman say something about, you know, if the Russians are winning, we should help the Germans. And if the Germans are winning, we should help the Russians. That way they'll kill as many of each other off as possible. So,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But again, thank you so much.
Yeah, man.
Okay, next is Norma. Please unmute yourself. Good.
Thank you. That's a lot of hard work. You're familiar with Lenny Brenner's Zionism in the Age of the Dictators? I put that into the chat. Lenny Brenner, Zionism in the Age of the Dictators. There is a time, I mean, the material is the same, only now. Which is fine. You know, there's a communist convention, Communist Party convention going on, and Joe Sims gave a presentation that I was allowed to listen to at the beginning, where he's telling us that the way that we're going to gain what we aim for is mass organizing, mass being on the streets, mass going door to door, making friends with everybody, and so on. And of course, he's right, because people don't know. I mean, we are trained into our position from the cradle. One of those devices is the compulsory public education that we're put through, education being the major commodity of our youth, of course, to fit into this society, to get a job. Job, what is it? A relation of our labor to our owners, to capital. You got to listen to Yanis Varoufakis about working on the economy. He went out of his way to take a position, you know, a few years ago in Europe, to be able to try to work with it and do something about it. And immediately the next time he was voted on, he had been voted into, I guess, the Greek parliament. And the next time he was voted on, he wasn't permitted to continue. The part of the work he had done had grown in popularity, but that didn't mean he was able to retain and advance the position of, he wanted to borrow a whole bunch of money and invest it in advancement of the things that we support. And he was definitely refused to be able to. We have been being lied to for 500 years. Every one of the politicians, the best of them, gets up there and says things that no way can they understand sufficiently, or do they have a way to figure out to do for the good stuff, you know, save Social Security and stuff like that. They don't know how to do it because it's being robbed from us. The chair is being pulled out from us every time we turn around. And the people that get elected are party to that. I mean, you've noticed that, everybody.
Okay.
Agreed.
Matt, do you have a response?
No, but
okay.
I agree.
Okay. Next is Sharon Rose, followed by Marilyn.
Thank you very much, Matt. I'm following up or deepening what Jean brought up and others. I sometimes despair that that people coming up in North America are ever going to learn the truth about history. So, and you know, this week I felt a lot of despair about this bullshit about how D-Day was the beginning of the defeat of the Nazis by the United States, and the complete dropping out of the history of World War II and the role of the Soviet people and the Chinese people in defeating fascism. So I do think that there needs to be a whole renewed effort among historians to figure out the best way to reach the ordinary people. I live in Oakland. Here in Oakland, California, some teachers got together and did a teach-in around Palestine, explaining the origins of the conflict. And there was a huge, effort to try and stop them. One person lost his job because he was a new teacher that was still on probation, but they did get somewhere and they got a lot of publicity for what they were doing. And I just feel like what my question is from the point of view of a historian like you, how do you see that process of trying to instill people's history among working people, ordinary people?
It's hard, because I tend to look at the most important driving factor for universal history that I focus on at this point, that I've come to realize is more important things I used to think was more important, is culture. So the culture war is the key thing. And the ability to just shape wisdom, encourage the cultivation of wisdom and the pursuit, which means the pursuit of truth, not even saying I own truth, but just pursuing it, being hungry for it, feeding the soul with the higher things. That's really, I think, we have a financier oligarchy that thinks about this a lot. They're really good at encouraging types of cultural processes that bring out the worst in us, the most atomized, selfish, oriented aspect of what makes humans human, in order to better have us control ourselves with the belief that we're free. So that's something that was behind the CIA's influence over the modern arts movements. People have probably heard of Frances Stoner Saunders and her work on the cultural Cold War, which documented beautifully. Sorry, I got cat hair in my mouth. Which documented beautifully the role of the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, and also the Congress for Cultural Freedom in providing hundreds of millions of dollars into radical atonalism in the music industry, the hardcore deconstructionist artwork as well. Jackson Pollock didn't know. He probably would not have been happy to have discovered that he was receiving all of this money from the CIA, but he was, as was Rothko and others. And I think that it wasn't just because the CIA cares about aesthetics. I think that there was a political effect on having a society lose its ability to judge rigor and beauty in the arts, which has a moralizing effect to it. And also the sciences became extracted of the arts, like the greatest scientists a century ago who were making all these wonderful discoveries, from Madame Curie and Mendeleev and Max Planck and Einstein. They were all musicians and artists, and that was a big part of their creative process, was working through the arts as part of the idea of tuning your mind to the universe. And that idea of the potent science was largely cut out, I think, artificially by design, in order to create a science which is purely based upon statistical logic, devoid of aesthetical sensibilities, and an artistic culture devoid of reason. The tyranny of reason that constricts your emotions to be free, that had to be severed so that our emotions could be free. But it's like, yeah, but what if your emotions are all underdeveloped and anxiety ridden? How is that necessarily creating an artistic movement that's making yourself or other people better? You're just expressing your anxiety. So that I think screwed a lot of people up. And so for me, I think that I love Paul Robeson so much because I read his speeches, I listen to him speak, and I hear his music, and you look at the way he conducted himself, and he demonstrated to me what a real integrated lover of humanity. He said it, right? The artists, the scientists have a choice to make, to either give their services to freedom or to slavery, and I have made my choice. And he said that to the freedom fighters in Spain against Franco when he was there. And I think that we need to sort of feed our souls on those types of people who potently activated that which was in themselves to awaken the better in their fellow men and women. and thus weaken the influence of said oligarchy. And whether it's, again, reading the writings of JFK, his speeches, feeding our minds on like how they did things, how we organized, and how we communicated our thoughts to each other without just going into fight or fly mode. Today, people are like, oh, I disagree with you, so I have to either fight you and condemn you or just like agree to disagree forever and like ignore that you exist. And it's like, well, what about like using just dignified respect and debate around reason? You know, like what about that? It's disappearing. So I think we just need to make that popular again. And I don't know how to do that in beyond what we're doing right now. You know.
Thank you. Yeah. Next is Marilyn, and then I'll have a question.
Well,
Yes.
Richard, I
Nancy-
think Sheila Harmonica also wanted to raise
Yeah,
her.
okay. And incidentally, I want to just tell people who don't know, you can raise your hand to ask a question by going to the reactions button down below, which is a happy face, and you can raise your hand, press that and raise your hand, and I'll recognize you. But go ahead, Marilyn.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. That was a great presentation. And I also want to thank you in your last answer for mentioning the Congress of Cultural Freedom, which I had never heard of until I read it in your work and the work of your wife, Cynthia Chung, about how the CIA had this effort to really destroy our values of beauty and aesthetics and culture that can tap into that part of our soul that is, you know, connected to our humanity, our basic humanity, our love of people that Paul Robeson embodies so beautifully. But my question for you is, I want to bring us back home and look at the calendar and remind everyone that it was 61 years ago tomorrow that the last time I think we had a US president who really showed some wisdom. And Matthew, perhaps you can comment on the significance of that speech that was given at the American University on June 10th, 1963, especially as we sit here now facing a leader who is, you know, trying to draw us into nuclear Armageddon.
JFK is just so good for the soul. The specific speech you're speaking of from June 10th, was that his Piece of the Grave speech, or was that it? Which one was that?
The American University speech where he's, you know, said we have to look at the mindset of our adversary and get to know where they're coming from, kind of thing.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's so much the quality of personality and mind and wisdom that he was bringing to the table at such a young age. It's really incredible. And I mean, he plays a prominent role in the second volume of The Clash of the Two Americas, and my wife's book as well has a few chapters on some of his efforts to create a mutual, to basically end the Cold War, the logic of mutual assured destruction. And, you know, he gave a presentation at the UN calling for a US-Russia joint space program together to co-manage and to jointly do all of these amazing feats in space instead of replicating vastly expensive, energy-intensive technologies and R&D. And it was a great idea. And Khrushchev, who I don't like, by the way, as a person, but that being said, his son wrote a book saying that his father wanted to accept that, except JFK died 3 weeks later. But there were all of these things that JFK was doing, not just negatively as far as like trying to get out of the war in Vietnam and to reduce the influence of the international financiers in a U.S. finance or the role of the J.P. Morgan steel barons at United Steel, like by supporting Kaiser Steel, which was a more pro-industrial, pro-national steel company working with the Pan-African movement. So you had all these like negative actions, but you had these positive actions too, based on like really, really bold grand designs for reviving the New Deal policies of FDR that he was inspired by. Eleanor Roosevelt was a big supporter of JFK, and he had a lot of discussions with South American leaders and African leaders around extending and reviving the types of discussions and plans that FDR had arranged for building Tennessee Valley authorities in Africa and beyond. So again, that was unfortunately short-lived, and he didn't have the wisdom of a de Gaulle. I don't think he had the support of a military intelligence network as de Gaulle was able to build up. JFK did not have that. He had his brother, maybe a couple of other people that he could trust, but for the most part, it was vipers and traitors everywhere around him that just was working to subvert him 24/7. So that's what makes it kind of tragic, but it's still a beautiful thing to look at the type of quality of mind and vision and strategy that was being brought to the table in opposition to this oligarchy. Yeah, it's quite something.
Thank you. Sheila, did you want to ask a question?
Yes, thank you. I apologize. I'm legally blind, so I have difficulty with all those little Zoom controls at the bottom. Thank you very much for your talk. You did leave out about FDR, that he imprisoned my parents and 120,000 other Japanese Americans in concentration camps in the United States solely on the basis of race. And adults, children, babies in orphanages who were as little as 1/32 Japanese in blood, that's a blood quota, were supposed to go into the camps. And excuse me, FDR had scientists at the he believed in the racial inferiority of the Japanese, and he had scientists at the Smithsonian studying the craniums, the skulls of Asians. This was outlined in a book called Allies of a Kind by Christopher Thorne. So I don't appreciate FDR despite the flowery words about democracy. It's really what you do that matters. And of course, we have to look at all politicians based on their actions.
Yeah, okay. Well, that was reprehensible what was done to the Japanese. I totally agree with that. And you know, I'm not trying to say only provide an angelic picture, but at the same time, I'm also saying that there is I don't know about the Smithsonian is evil. It's run by, and it was found like since the 19th century, a bunch of hardcore racists and eugenicists were always managing the Smithsonian, kind of like a Federal Reserve for anthropology and culture. That's what it was. I don't know. I've never seen the evidence that FDR was a racist in that sense or sanctioned those policies at the Smithsonian. I don't know that, but I took note of the book and I'll read it and have a look. What I do know is that there was a vast effort to kill him by those hard fascists that were supporting the rise of Nazism and fascism, who really, really wanted that in a bad way. And, you know, you could look at those two attempts by Smedley Butler, and the one, and the other one was Giuseppe Zingara, the Italian Freemasonic anarchist who tried to shoot FDR and killed Mayor Cermak sitting next to him. And I know that there's certain policies that we could learn a lot from as far as utilizing national power to gain control over the economy, to direct credit towards building projects that benefit the people and not the private financiers that want fascism. Like, those are precedences that we can learn from. The thing on the Japanese approach, I find that abhorrent. I agree with you. Also, like, not giving sanctuary to the Jews, that wasn't cool. That was wrong. But again, it's like we're at battle against an oligarchy that is in crunch time for the big kill now. They're going for it. So I'm looking for what can we extract from lessons of history that can be wielded in battle today. And there are some serious lessons that they don't want us to learn from, about how the United States was able to break up the banks and build up the real economy, and also support through the Lend-Lease program Russia's fight against the Nazis that the British didn't even want America to help out with. So those are all like things that we could learn from.
Thank you. The next question is Rich J, followed by Michael H, and those will be our last questions. Go ahead, Rich. Rich, you have to unmute yourself, Rich. Okay, Michael H, go ahead.
Yeah. So my understanding is during World War II, not only were the Japanese in America locked up, but the Japanese in Canada were locked up. And I believe there was even an effort to go down to Peru and Brazil and find Japanese and bring them to Texas. And those Japanese were sent back to Japan and never given citizenship again in those countries. But then on the other hand, there were guys in Japan like Unit 731 that was torturing Chinese people. There was all kinds of reports of cannibalism. The Japanese soldiers were running out of meat, so they killed local people like in New Guinea and India and other places and ate them to, sustenance and stuff like that. So, I mean, if we're going back to World War II and the Japanese, it seems like a very, very complex situation that it's probably better not to dwell too much on.
Well, I mean,
Okay.
I think it shouldn't be ignored. But at the same, I guess it's like the way again I see it is we're at war against the same beast that tried to create a eugenics-based world government 80 years ago, and they're committed to they have a certain modus operandi that involves they're just as fascist today as they were 80 years ago, and they're just as rooted in eugenics, although it's not called eugenics anymore, but it's still eugenics as far as attempting to make population reduction a science, based on an elitist idea that there's a superior class of Nietzschean overhumans who are like a different species that are mandated to control. And today it's called transhumanism, but there's this self-representation of the better species that can control the levers of CRISPR technology, infusing us with neural links like Elon Musk promotes in order to stay relevant from the rise of the self-thinking machines that's going to like take over like Skynet. So they got this whole ideology, which is essentially trying to control the levers of evolution to favor an initiated priest class under a slave society of master-slave relations, and political systems called fascism, but maybe with a democratic face, maybe with local controls or 15-minute cities that they want to like give us the illusion of like mini freedoms. You're free to pick what kind of pizza you want to have in, with your or purchase with the credits, and what species of crickets you want in your pizzas, that you can maybe access with your credits. But it's not real freedom. This is a 15-minute city, fake bottom-up freedom. It's fake, and it's really fascist in its top-down ideology. And so that's what we have to fight today. And yeah, 731 was given jobs at Fort Detrick, Maryland. That's important. That the U.S. bio warfare complex was grown out of Hiro Ishii's entire Unit 731. That was employed to take the lessons that they learned in World War II, and now they were given U.S. Washington sponsorship to carry them out, which grew the U.S. biowarfare capabilities in Korea. They did it to Koreans during the Korean War. They grew it massively to the present day, where there's like 300. The Chinese government says they estimate about 340 international biolabs run by the Pentagon are peppering the world. 48 in Ukraine alone, another 40 in Georgia at least. There's at least 60 in South Korea under the Jupiter Centaur laboratories that are like carrying out weaponized anthrax development that got, there's protests in South Korea on the streets of people who are pissed off that like the Pentagon's weaponized anthrax is being transferred to these complexes in FedEx packages. This is scandalous. And we're not told any of this in the West. We're like given self-congratulating messaging about how great we are, and none of this is. You have to go to South Korean press agencies to know about this. It's a big deal there. So all that to say, Japan, we blew them up, and then you got the head of Japan coming to Washington, calling for a U.S. Japanese special relationship to protect them from the nuclear threat of Russia. I mean, we unnecessarily bombed a defeated Japan to the Stone Age and then occupied it for 80 years, where there's still 58,000 U.S. troops stationed in Japan to this day. Now, it's not a sovereign country. They're being incorporated into AUKUS as we stand, right? Into the NATO of the Pacific. It's insane. So yeah, I mean, to that extent, we should be looking at all of these these dynamics of history and taking them into our current analysis.
Okay.
As well as the wrongs that we did too. You know, we gotta own up to the abuses.
It's
Well,
10:33.
Yeah.
Hello?
Thank you.
Kit would like to speak. Hello?
If this is finished. I'm sorry, I have my phone working. I don't know, do we have time for another question or do we have to cut it off?
Well, I think we've gone 2 hours now. We've gone through all the questions. So
Give her a question. It's okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. I thank you very much for speaking, Matt. I appreciate a lot of what you're saying because I have heard this stuff before, but it's usually talked about in other circles that are left. And I would like you to talk about the theories. I'm not saying this,
I can't hear you.
Can't hear.
The connection is very bad. So we're going to have to wind it up there, unfortunately.
Yeah, so sorry. I just couldn't make out what you were saying. The connection was super bad.
There must be a rainstorm in her area too.
But send me an email. Send me my email's in the chat box. Send me an email. I'll try to address it.
Okay. Thank you.
All right.
Well, I want to thank you again, Matt Ehret, for joining us today, and hope everybody will come back for Raj's presentation on the Indian elections next week. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Nebo Proctor Marxist Library receives no corporate funding, nor do we have any paid staff. We rely on the support of working class folks that share our commitment to the socialist legacy of Karl Marx. We continue to need funds to meet necessary expenses, since we can no longer pass the hat at our in-person forums. Please send contributions to our treasurer, either online via PayPal or by check. The PayPal ID is ICSS Sunday, SUNDAY, @yahoo.com, and the name is Richard Fallenbaum. And checks may be made out to Richard Fallenbaum and sent to him at 1225 Nielsen Street, Berkeley, California, 94706. Fallenbaum is spelled Fallenbaum. To donate directly to the Marxist Library, send a check to the Nebo Proctor Marxist Library at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California, 94609, or directly or donate online at www.paypal.me/npml. For information, write to npml at marxistlibr.org, and the website is marxistlibr.org.